really?
Well, I don't live near them, so I can't. It's gonna be tough to videotape it. Maybe for the couples that live together, I'll tell like the one what's gonna happen.
Take off class.
It'll be like a field trip, right? We can like go around to like each one. You guys can get out all your classes. All right, so last class we talked about shifts in the supply and demand curves. So anything unrelated to price that's going to move either supply or demand. It's going to change the entire curve that firms or consumers are facing. And then we looked at how these changes in supply and demand, how that impacted the price and the quantity in equilibrium in this market. And we talked about how there's a lot of variables that can shift supply and demand. So there's a lot of different things going on that can cause things to change in the economy. Because there's so many potential things that can shift supply and demand, we end up with supply and demand curves that are constantly shifting. So this equilibrium condition that we typically have, or that we like try to like get to, isn't very common. We're constantly moving out of it, and then the invisible hand moving us back towards the new equilibrium. When I was an undergrad, this was like the toughest part for me to understand, because you look at the real world and it doesn't look like a market in equilibrium. And that's because so many of these things are constantly changing. I mean, think of like, I don't know, the end of the season for clothes. The demand curve is going to shift to the left because people don't want like last season stuff, so they're going to drop the price considerably. There are things that are like constantly happening that if you look at equilibrium as like a static condition, is like that's the goal, you get there and that's it, then you're not going to understand like why that happens. So just walk through real quick how to draw a supply demand curve, like for an exam, because I don't think I went through that well enough when we first did it. So you've got the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. We're always going to put them that way. Supply curve is going to be upward sloping. Anyone tell me why the supply curve is upward sloping? It's not related to demand.
Because you can always make more.
You're on the right track. You're missing a word. What else?
Sellers want to sell more at a higher price?
Yeah, as the price goes up, they're going to be willing to sell more because it's going to be more expensive to produce more. And we've got demand sloping down because obviously as consumers, you can imagine, cheaper something is, the more that you'll want to buy. So if we draw a shift in the demand curve, and say it shifts out to the right, we'll draw another curve parallel to that. And typically the way we denote that this is now a new curve, this isn't the original, is we put a little tick mark next to it. If you want, you could like label this 1, so that's the original, and then make that 2 to show that that's like the second one. Something to distinguish that this curve is the original, and then this one's the new one. And then the arrow helps you, and then helps me reading, like if you're drawing it. That helps me see what happened, or where we're moving from. Just makes it easier to read. The initial equilibrium is the point where these two supply and demand curves cross. The way we typically label that, we put the P and the Q there. Originally, put a little asterisk next to it. Again, to show that that's the equilibrium. But if you want, if you're using the 1 and 2 designation, you also put a little 1 there. Just try to be consistent. If you're using 1, use 1 there. Again, just so it's easy to figure out what's going on, so I can tell what's going on, and so you can keep track of what's happening. And then when you get this shift, you can use the Q2. Or if you're using the original with like the tick mark, see with a tick mark. Again, just try to stay consistent with how you're labeling things, so that way, like when I'm grading, it's easy to tell. And when you're looking at it, Maybe you come back to the problem later, you know what you were doing, so you don't get yourself confused. Okay, so what happens when supply increases? Let's say there's a new entrant into the market. Remember, when there's a new entrant into the market, that's going to shift the demand curve to the right. It's going to shift the supply curve to the right. It will increase supply because there's now more firms that are offering the good for sale. Looking at this, we have the supply curve shifting to the right as, in this case, Apple enters the market for smartwatches. This P1 is the original equilibrium price. If we stay at that initial price, we'll be out here on this new supply curve. Yeah, let me draw that so you don't have to watch my hands slide around. So we're initially in equilibrium here, and then the supply curve shifts to the right. If we stay at this initial equilibrium price, the quantity demanded is going to be here, while quantity supplied will be here, while the quantity demanded will be over here. People will only be willing to pay for this many smartwatches at that price, but firms will be willing to supply more at that price. So what's going to happen? There's a surplus of goods. Firms don't want to keep all these goods laying around that it costs them money to keep on the shelves, costs them to keep in inventory, and they're not getting any money back for it. So they'll be willing to lower the price. So they'll move along the supply curve. As the price is decreasing, consumers are going to be willing to buy more. So they'll move along the demand curve. Again, it's easy to imagine. You buy stuff all the time. The cheaper it gets, the more you're willing to buy. And this will happen all the way down. Invisible hand forces it down to this new equilibrium point where the supply curve, new supply curve, crosses the demand curve. So then this becomes the new equilibrium quantity, and there's the new equilibrium price. So we end up with, from before, there are now more smartwatches available, and they're available at a lower price. Okay, we don't have something for demand here, so let's look at a shift in demand. Let's say, what happens if income increases? So consumers' income increases, demand curve is going to shift to the right. We keep offering goods at that equilibrium price. Quantity demand is going to be out here, but the quantity supplied is going to be over here. So where does that leave us? Seriously, there's a shortage. So there's a shortage of goods. There's more people willing to buy than there are goods available. Firms are going to realize they can raise the price without losing any consumers. They're going to slowly increase the price, and they're going to move along the supply curve. And because they're now charging at a higher price, it's now feasible for them to start producing more. It's worth it for them because they have to pay more to increase production. And while the price is increasing, consumers are willing to buy fewer of that good. So we're moving along the supply curve, moving along the demand curve, all the way up to this new equilibrium point. So new equilibrium price is higher, and the quantity, equilibrium quantity, is also higher. Okay, so these are simple results. These are pretty straightforward. It's like fairly easy to predict the effects because we're just shifting one curve at a time and seeing what happens. You know that if supply shifts to the right, you're going to decrease the price, increase the quantity demanded, and the quantity that's being sold. But what happens if both curves shift? This is going to end up being harder. We can't automatically be sure what's going to happen, what the relationship's going to be. Okay, that's basically the stuff we talked. Oh, sorry, I was started too early. Yes, okay. So John Maynard Keynes said in the long run we're all dead, but also in the long run both of these curves are going to shift. So let's say the number of firms increase and the productivity increases. This is pretty common in the world, what we've seen happen in history. And also demand is going to increase. So the population grows and the income of workers increases, or consumers increases. So we end up with both supply and demand shifting. Now, not just these four variables can shift, also there's all the other variables we talked about can also shift. And in some markets, they may go the other way. People's income increases, that has the opposite effect, for inferior goods. So it'll be different than a market for a normal good. But here, this slide has an example, again, for smartwatches. This is a pretty common outcome. So we got the supply shifting to the right, and we have the demand shifting to the right. Now, how much the supply curve and the demand curve shift helps determine the ultimate outcome, what the effect's going to be. So for this model, the demand curve shifts to the right more than the supply curve does. So in this case, what we see, the initial equilibrium price is here. We have the supply curve shifting to the right a little bit, demand curve shifting to the right a lot. So we end up with an increase in the quantity in equilibrium. We also end up with an increase in price. When both the supply curve and demand curve shift to the right, both of them are going to increase the equilibrium quantity, as you see up there. But if you increase the supply, that's going to decrease price. It'll put downward pressure on it. Or if you increase demand, that's going to increase the price. So because of that, we're not sure what's going to happen to price. In this case, because the demand curve shifts more, we're going to end up with a slight increase in price. But this isn't necessarily the case. That's not guaranteed to happen. Here we have the opposite scenario. Say the supply increases substantially, that the firms producing smartwatches become a lot more productive. They need like a lot fewer workers. Maybe they have like a new machine they're using to produce them a lot faster. Whatever, they've increased productivity a lot more than consumer incomes or than the population of people that are willing to buy smartwatches. So in this case, we end up with equilibrium price falling. The quantity is still increasing. That's going to happen no matter what when both of these curves shift to the right. But because there's a greater increase in supply than there was an increase in demand, we end up with a lower equilibrium price. So if you don't know the relative size of these two changes of supply and demand, then you don't know what the effect on price is going to be. And as I note, it is possible that if both the supply and demand curve move by the exact same amount, that you could have no effect on price. So if you're like doing this on an exam, if I ask you to like shift both of those, and I don't tell you which one shifts more than the other, just pick one, and then explain to me like the supply curve shifts more than the demand curve, so therefore the price is going to fall. So since 1700, what do you think has happened to the world? Has supply shifted more or has demand shifted more?
Equally.
You say equally?
probably supply of anything, it's this really just very international, so much easier now. Also more people in the world, so that's a lot too.
Yeah, there's a lot more people. There's a lot more trade. Any other suggestions or ideas? Think of how poor people were in 1700, what their life was like, what our lives are like now. So what most economists estimate that living standards have increased by about 3,000% since 1700. So we're seeing a substantial increase in the standard of living. But the price of goods are much lower than before. So many of the goods we have today weren't available back then, but the amount of time someone has to work in order to afford goods like what we had back then, like clothing, food, house. I don't know what they do for fun back then, like play cards and like read. So like for those things, the amount of time you have to work in order to be able to afford those is so much lower than it was before. So that implies that there's a much larger increase in the supply curve than the demand curve. So where back then we might have had a equilibrium price way up here and not that many goods, but the supply curve shifted so far out, we're now, and the demand curve will shift that a little bit, we're now down here where it's way cheaper than before to buy this stuff, and we have way more of it. So this is caused by an increase in innovation and entrepreneurship. They've combined to give us not only new goods that we didn't have before, but higher quality goods. Even in things like farming, they learned different techniques of like how to rotate crops in the field to keep the soil from losing all the nutrients in it. So plants can continue to grow year after year on the same plot of land. All the way to developing new technologies, not only just like consumer technologies that we can enjoy, like as like final products, but also going into the production of stuff to make it even cheaper. Like Elon Musk was showing off this factory the other day. That's literally just like all robots putting together Teslas. I mean, there's still a lot of problems with this factories and it's still pretty expensive to operate. But imagine 30, 40 years from now, fully automated factories. It'll decrease the cost of production substantially. So there's a nice quote that the beauty in the Industrial Revolution wasn't making the queen a million silk stockings, it was providing stockings that a million stock girls could afford. This idea that things are becoming much, much easier for people to afford and people to actually buy. And this substantially lower price suggests that we've seen a much larger increase in supply than we have in demand. Okay, and this is just another slide to caution you. So suppose that there's an increase in supply that occurs. So we know the equilibrium quantity is going to increase and the price is going to decrease. So it's easy to get tripped up and to think that a decrease in price that results from this is going to cause an increase in demand. So a shift in the demand curve in response, but that's not what's going to happen. So we got the increase in supply here. We end up with a decrease in price. That's not going to cause the demand curve to shift at all. Remember, we're going to move along the demand curve. So when you have an increase in the supply curve, or any change in the supply or demand curve, the other one just moves along that curve. We don't actually see the curve itself shifting. There's a blurb on like half or 3/4 of a page in the back of the chapter that describes how this can go wrong and why it's wrong. But just remember, we're moving along. If the supply curve shifts, we're moving along the demand curve. We're not also shifting the demand curve. Okay. So let's look at a real world example of this. Supply and demand trashes recycling. That was a turn of phrase the textbook used. I didn't come up with that corny joke. Although I wouldn't come up with a better joke. You guys probably know that by now. So let's talk about the trash. Cities for years have been contracting with private firms to collect recycling. A lot of them have recycling laws, like requiring people or substantially encouraging people to recycle their plastic. Now, this is good for cities, created less trash. It was good for the environment. It's also good for these companies that they contracted out to. They were earning some pretty decent profits. And when the price you could get for recycling plastic was high, not only did these companies make good money, but they even had problems with people going around on the streets, stealing recycling out of people's recycling containers, taking it themselves to get money. This lasted for a while, but around 2014, 2015, oil prices started to fall. And that ended up decreasing demand for recycled plastic. At the same time, the costs for firms were increasing. And they were increasing because cities started requiring more and more types of plastic to be recycled. Initially, it was just milk jugs and soda 2 liters. But it ended up going to plastic bags and fast food containers and takeout food containers. Lower quality plastic that was more difficult to actually recycle, to melt down into pure plastic or whatever. And increase the cost of having to sort them into different bins for, for different recycling processes they needed to do. At the same time, fracking took off, so that increased the supply of natural gas and oil. Natural gas and oil are used to make plastic. So new plastic becomes cheaper, so it's less desirable for these firms to buy recycled plastic from these recycling places. So what happened in the market for recycled plastic? Okay, so new plastic is a substitute for recycled plastic. So as the cost of the substitute decreases, what's going to happen to demand? It's now cheaper to use a similar product for the same purpose. Demand's going to shift to less. Yeah, you're going to use less of it. So now as cities began requiring new types of plastic, it became more costly for these firms, these recycling firms. They have to separate them, like I said, they have to do maybe different processes to the lower quality plastic. So this is going to increase the cost of operating. So what's increasing the cost going to do? Yeah, it's going to shift supply to the left. So let's draw the initial equilibrium here, so I don't forget. All right, so what's the result of this, given how we've drawn these curves? We end up with a lower quantity in equilibrium. And we end up with a lower price. Now, the textbook says, this is an example I took from there, that demand decreased more than the supply decreased. That because it was so much cheaper to use new plastic, these firms that were previously buying recycled plastic weren't buying recycled plastic anymore. So because their demand decreased by more than supply, we end up with the new equilibrium price decreasing. And of course, the new equilibrium quantity is decreasing. All right, do you guys have any questions about shifts in both the supply and demand curve? All right, well, let's take a break here. Do you guys have any random questions or statements or questions about the class?
What's your favorite sports team?
Favorite sports team? New York Giants.
Any particular reason why?
Growing up, when I was growing up, my grandpa, my mom, and my uncle were all Giants fans, and we had lunch at my grandparents' house every Sunday. Plus, the first year I actually paid attention to football was 2000. I was 8 years old, and the Giants went to the Super Bowl that year, lost to Ray Lewis and the Ravens. So it was exciting watching them win. Something I haven't really been used to in the years since.
So that's what's kind of understanding.
My dad's an Eagles fan, and twice a year, every year, the Giants do something stupid, give up a punt return for a touchdown or fumble in the last 2 minutes, and the Eagles beat them. So I get a lot of shit from him for the constant losing.
We've been in the building since the 80s, so.
Yeah, I don't even know how to accompany you with that. I know fans like some random sports team.
New Zealand All Blacks.
What sport's that?
Rugby.
Okay.
Favorite.
All right, now we can move on a little bit. So talk about equilibrium in the real world. So the case of occupational licensing. My main job here is working for the NE Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation. So we catalog all the occupational licensing laws out there, and then what Ed and I do is write academic papers that no one ever reads, trying to estimate the effects of these things. So basically, the idea of licensing is like a permission slip from the government to work. They pass laws saying that you have to have a certain level of education, training, take exams, have things like good moral character, be a certain age, pay certain fees. It doesn't really happen in the business world besides the CPA, but for a lot of different professionals that provide services, well, whether it's lawyers, whether it's anyone in healthcare, or things like contractors, electricians, plumbers, they all need licenses. Again, the idea is to prove that you've got some level of competency so that consumers can feel confident in actually, hiring this person or getting the service from them. And these are passed at the state level primarily instead of the national level. So every state has different stuff. And there's a lot of occupations. There are tons of occupations that are licensed in some states but not others. It can be seemingly random. So there's things like egg handler in 2 or 3 states, where you literally put an egg between you and a light, and you look to see if the yolk's big enough. They need a license in a couple states. Horse masseuse, some real random stuff, in addition to doctors, lawyers, dentists, the stuff we imagine. Now there's different levels of occupational regulation. There's registration, where you basically just tell the government that you're a professional in this field, give them some information, so if you screw someone over, they can contact you so you can get sued. Then there's certification, where it's not a requirement, but if you get through a level of education, certain level of education, do your training, and pass the exam, you can say, I'm now a certified this, instead of just a regular version of that. And then there's licensing, which is required by law. You cannot practice without having that license. Like I said, the purpose is prevent low-skilled professionals from entering the occupation, so that people don't have to worry, especially in healthcare, you don't have to worry about getting hurt by someone. You don't have to worry about a doctor messing up the medicine for your eye infection and having it get worse. Not only does it protect consumers from harm, but it makes them more confident. Again, we talked about before how there's a lack of knowledge. There's often information asymmetry, where the person offering the service or selling you the good has more knowledge about it than what you have. They know whether they're good or not, and it's more difficult for you to tell. So it's a way to say, hey, I've done this, this, and this, so you know I'm at least decent. People are more willing to buy a car. At least that's the idea. And licensing has grown substantially since the 50s. In the 50s, less than 5% of people that worked had a license. Now it's up around 25. And the blue line there, red line is licensing, the blue line is labor unions. We've seen labor unions decline about the same rate licensing has increased as we move from more manufacturing, where they're union heavy, we're more into services as an economy now. Now we have more licensing. Some of that was driven by more people providing services. Some of it's driven by more occupations being licensed. So licensing has these good effects. It keeps out the charlatans and the snake oil salesmen from actually hurting people, and it keeps out the low quality professionals from hurting people. And it makes consumers more confident to actually be able to buy goods and services in the market. The idea is that they should be willing to pay for more services because they now have some idea of the quality of these professions. But licensing has side effects. It limits competition. It raises professionals' wages. And there's other things like it reduces movement between states and slows innovation. But the first two, it limits competition and raises professionals' wages, are things we can talk about using supply and demand. So up there I have a basic supply and demand curve. You put in these barriers to entry, it's now more difficult for you to get into a profession. It takes more time and more money. That will drive people out, let them, or encourage them to go other places. If you don't have a ton of money on hand, or if it's difficult for you to take out a big loan to go to college for, say, 7 years to be a physical therapist, when like 15 years ago you needed a bachelor's degree. Now you need to get your doctorate. That's going to keep a lot more people out of the industry. So it's going to decrease the supply. Let's move the supply way to the left. What's going to happen? We're decreasing the quantity in there. At the same time, we're increasing the prices of their services. So we're increasing their wages. So not just in the market for goods, can we talk about, can we use supply and demand? But this right here, basic labor market. We're seeing that things, so in this case, a regulation like occupational licensing, it decreases the supply, and then we get the same effect that we do in a typical market for goods. We have a reduction in the quantity demanded and an increase in the price. So maybe there's more consumer confidence, so they're more willing to buy. There's less information asymmetry. So that may shift the supply curve, or the demand curve, excuse me, to the right. That's going to increase the price a little bit more, but it's going to increase the quantity demanded some. Of course, that depends on how much the demand curve shifts relative to the supply curve shift. On an exam, I'm not going to have supply and demand shift in different directions because we went over them shifting in the same direction. But this is just an illustration of what would happen. And it's, when you have them shifting opposite directions, price is going to move in the same direction. And then the quantity demanded is going to be ambiguous. So the exact opposite of when they're in the same direction. All right, so that's the end of the chapter. It's Friday. There's about 10 minutes left in class, so it's a little late to start a whole new chapter. So you guys take off. Have a good weekend.